Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to our session. I'm very eager and happy and finally excited to be in conversation with Manoj Mitta. And he has written this absolute stunner of a book. It takes a long time to read, but every minute of it is worth your while because every single page in that book is our history. It's a history of how we won the small rights we have. It's a history of the civil rights against caste system. It's a history of, you know, the far right and the traditionalists and the conservatives and the progressives. And it's immense. I mean, it's a history we don't read in school. So I think we must be immensely grateful that someone took the time to go through so much of archival material and wrote a book on caste. I mean, he calls it caste pride, but I think the word pride there is very operative because in my reading, it was a book about caste violence. It was a book about what they considered disgrace. It was a book about so much of the hatred that surrounds caste system. So so Manoj, how long did it take for you to write this book? This is a starter question.
I'm embarrassed to answer this question. It took 7 long years because this is not the book I originally meant to write. I had done a couple of books on mass violence targeting minorities. The first one was on the 1984 carnage in Delhi, and the second one was on the 2002 Gujarat carnage. And the third book I originally intended to write was on violence targeting Dalits. You know, recurring instances of such violence across the country, some of which I happen to deal with as a journalist. But then when I got into those cases, I found myself coming again and again into, running into the same wall, which is that some arm or the other of the Indian state betrays what was clearly structural bias. So I felt the need to examine this question. Where was it coming from? Why there was this gap between the rhetoric and reality? And when I looked up the existing literature on caste for answers, I couldn't find any. Nor did any of the books on law also really give a proper answer. So I therefore was compelled to look up the archives myself, go beyond my comfort zone. I was not, as a journalist, very accustomed to going to archives, but then it was well worth it. One thing led to another, and I found myself unearthing a whole wealth of legislative and judicial battles going back 2 centuries in different parts of the country, including, I dare say, Thiruvananthapuram, or what was then Travancore. Though it was technically not part of British India, but there were such battles fought here as well. And I assume that in the course of our discussion...
Thank you, Manoj. I'm just going to stop you there. So you looked at 200 years worth of archival material, you went through memorandums, you went through press releases, all of that constitutes archive. And before we even launch into the book, I have a big question. Everybody, at least very politically, it's a topical thing. What is Sanatana Dharma, right? Like somebody, at least in Tamil Nadu, the idea is that Sanatana Dharma is the caste system. And when you say you're against Sanatana Dharma, you're trying to say we need to abolish the caste system, we need to annihilate the caste system, we need to work against the caste system. But a lot of people have taken exception to it. They have said that, you know, Sanatana Dharma is other things, it's values, it's another set of things, you know, it's not just the caste system. So, and as somebody who has, you know, seen through this much of information, what would be your very dispassionate understanding of what is Sanatana Dharma? Who is a Sanatani?
Okay, let me clarify at the outset that I am a journalist and I am familiar with this subject merely because I went through these archives, through these debates, in which there were 2 sets of Hindus battling out this question, you know, conservatives and liberals. So I confirm that the suggestion that is being made by a certain section, that Sanatanis were those who believed in caste system, is borne out by those debates, because conservatives did call themselves Sanatanis, And the liberals who were opposing them on these various reform debates, caste reform debates, did refer to them as Sanatanis. And let me add that even Savarkar, who's a hero of Hindutva, when he was the president of Hindu Mahasabha in early 1940s, when when Hindu Mahasabha had entered coalition governments in some of the provinces with Muslim parties, including Muslim League, he entered into negotiations with Orthodox Hindus, who he, in his book, refers to as Sanatanis. Because Savarkar himself, being an atheist or being a reformer of sorts, he did not consider himself a Sanatani. He was referring to these Orthodox Hindus with who he was negotiating, who he was assuring that he would not let his Hindu Mahasabha governments, the governments in which Hindu Mahasabha had a role, he was ensuring them that they would not go to the extent of passing laws that would force the temples to be thrown open to untouchables. Because that was a big deal. That was central to their understanding, to the understanding of Sanatanis. So yes, Sanatanis were people who believed in values of a timeless nature, and those values did include the Varna system, which is there in several of our scriptures, and not just Manusmriti.
My second question is slightly related also to the things that we have been talking about, which is, you said that you worked 7 years on this book, and your previous work was on the violence against the Sikhs. And so I see a general pattern in terms of, you've studied a lot on violence against Dalits and lower caste people, and also a lot on violence against minorities. And I think one of the self-defining natures of, let's say, majoritarian, authoritarian Hindutva is the violence against Dalits and lower caste people, the violence against minorities, and the violence against women. But your understanding of this violence goes beyond the very graphic examples of violence we see, murders, rape, massacre, and it goes into how the structure, how a machinery, whether it's the structure of the state or the structure of the legislative, the structure of the judiciary, how the structural violence also takes place on these people. So would you like to expound a little bit on that?
When I said earlier that I felt the need to go into the legal history of caste, it did serve the purpose of explaining where this impunity is coming from. There were these unresolved legal battles of colonial vintage, which helped to understand many of the current fault lines relating to caste. I'll give you an example. One of the major discoveries in my book is the first ever legislation against untouchability. Those who had not read my book, I dare say, wouldn't know about it for the simple reason that something so important was somehow missed by historians and other academics who dealt with the caste question. The first ever legislation was not by against untouchability was not by Ambedkar. In fact, Ambedkar became a legislator only in 1927, and this legislation took place in 1926, and it was not in Bombay Presidency but in Madras Presidency. And what is truly remarkable about it, and what is indeed a reason for all of us to remember it and commemorate it as an amazing example of emancipation, of a heroic struggle, was the fact that the man who drafted, piloted, and was instrumental in the enactment of that legislation was himself a Dalit. Yet he is not known. His name is R. Veerayan. Now, he took baby steps. In the limited resources that were available to him, he smuggled these provisions into some civic law to ensure that Dalits were allowed to walk on the same streets, to go to the same marketplace. Now, people in the South, those who have historical awareness of how caste played out in the South, would know that what South saw was not just untouchability. It also had an aggravated form of untouchability called unapproachability or unseeability. So roads were a big issue. Now, he was the one who makes this not just institutional breakthrough, it's a civilizational breakthrough. Why do I call it so? Because he is the first one who had the audacity to conceive and lobby enough support against all odds. Enough support from who? From caste Hindus. Look at the efforts he put in. He is the one who conceives of a law which treats what is considered a sacrosanct part of a Hindu way of life. That an upper caste Hindu, particularly a Brahmin, couldn't allow a lower caste person to come anywhere near him because that would be polluting him. That would be something that's unacceptable from his religious point of view. So what is considered, what they are accustomed to seeing as part of their religious way of life, he had the audacity to force the legislature to accept that it was actually a crime, that it was something that was offensive, that it was violating the basic rights, the value of equality and fraternity. So he was the one who conceived of it. Now, and he, ensures that not only are those offenses defined, but punishments were imposed. Although in his time, all he could do was that the punishment was of monetary nature. But there was a conceptual breakthrough he made there, that it is an offense and that it could be punished, right? Now, come to what happened in 1937-38. That is when Congress comes to power in Madras Presidency, the very same province. And it was headed by none other than Rajaji, one of the great freedom fighters, one of the chief lieutenants of Gandhi, somebody who apparently engaged with caste a great deal. Now what does he do? The bill that he comes up with does not build on, does not take forward Virayan's legislation. All it does is, it says, it's a declaratory law. It says that any custom that perpetuates untouchability shall not hereafter be recognized by courts. It does not, however, say what would happen if somebody commits untouchability, because there's no definition of that offense, nor is there any punishment imposed for it. So in a sense, it was a step backwards. Now, why does Rajaji do that? Because he, coming from where he does, he was a little too conscious, a little too sensitive of the fact that there was no criminal intent in the mind of these Brahmins. It is a way of life for them. It is part of their religious way of life. So for it to be treated as a crime and for them to be punished for that was a bit too radical. So he was trying to do it in a very slow, incremental way. But then if you take the totality of the picture into account, if you look at it from the point of view of the victims, then it is an offense which needed to be penalized. So what history books tell you is that the first ever law against untouchability is passed by Rajaji government. That is all that is recorded. The more radical, the more meaningful legislation that was passed a decade earlier by a Dalit was lost sight of. This is one glaring example of how history is written by victors, right?
Thank you.
So in this instance, the dominant narrative is still in the hands of caste Hindus. So these inconvenient facts, many of such are there in my book. It was left to this book coming out in 2023 to bring to light.
Thank you,
Sorry for that
Manoj.
long
No,
explanation.
absolutely. It's very fascinating, very interesting. And actually, I wanted to pick on a few things that you said. So one of the things that stands out from the Veerayan story, but is also true for other Tamil stalwarts like Rettamalai Srinivasan, Ayodhidasa Pandidar, even going, let's say, to Periyar, or here to Ambedkar, or even going backwards to the Justice Party, is that whoever was trying to challenge caste was always the broader narrative, especially by the Congress at that time, was that you're not a nationalist. There's a bigger struggle going on. There's the bigger national struggle going on. And why are you fixated on caste? Yeah. And it's very interesting because today, you have some intellectuals in the right who say caste is a Western concept. So, but on the other hand, people who were actually challenging caste at that time were constantly branded as, you know, being not nationalist enough. And for me, I think that's something I want you to unpack.
And in some cases, they were accused of being collaborators.
Yeah,
Why? Because they were diverting attention from political struggle to these social issues, which they considered to be divisive. It's going to divide Hindu society when they should be focused on political emancipation. Now,
yeah. So they must all swear allegiance to the Congress. But again, in many ways, we see, and it can come as very depressing read when you go through history, right? Some Congress stalwarts like Satyamurthy Iyer or others often take positions which are like, you know, in general, like backward, like against the Devadasi system or abolition of child marriage, or even like, I mean, when you look at the debates, you always don't find Congress to be the most radical party, right?
Absolutely.
And they have always been trying to pander to the traditionalists. And I wanted you to just comment a little bit about how people we assume now are very progressive. For instance, I wanted to talk about Shanmugam Chetty, India's first finance minister, who is otherwise very progressive, but how history shows that there is another aspect to, you know.
Yeah, you've asked too many questions.
Sorry.
I don't know where to begin with.
Yeah. So no, just two basic questions for me. One is, how do sometimes progressive, technically people we see as progressive tend to.
So let me answer that first.
Yeah.
You know, there's a political subtext to this. It's not just about the motives of the leaders of the time. You know, they might have their own justification for saying, let's keep the social issue away from the political struggle. Let this be prioritized, and we will address that in good time, right? Now, there might have been justification for that. But what justification do historians have to perpetuate that line even in this day and age? Why do we know only about freedom fighters and not about equality champions? You know, they're not necessarily the same. You know, we found, the historians found it convenient to focus on political struggle. Why? Because the villain in the political struggle, in that freedom struggle, is who? Is the white man, is a foreigner. But when it comes to these social battles, social reform battles, especially caste battles, who is the villain? The villain is our own elite, Hindu elite. So those are inconvenient facts which they were trying to avoid. So we know much more, or our history books focus on political struggle, but these social reform struggles, important as they were neglected. As a result, I mean, those battles remained unresolved, and they do have a role to play in the current fissures, in the current fault lines. If there is so much impunity for caste violence, even in this day and age, it has to do, among other reasons, with the fact that we never confronted this monster. And here is the social struggle predates colonial rule, and it continues even after we got political emancipation. It's still, plaguing our country. Still, untouchability is such a big reality. Still, there is so much opposition to intercaste marriage. I mean, let's not limit ourselves to the plight of those who are at the bottom of the hierarchy. Intercaste marriage is an issue that affects Hindus across the board. And this might come as a surprise to many, that not too long ago, intercaste marriage was forbidden. It was considered illegal. Anybody who had intercaste marriage were accused of living in sin, and their children were considered illegitimate. And it was in year 1918, somebody called Vittalbhai Patel, who's none other than the elder brother of Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, who introduced a bill seeking to legalize intercaste marriage and to confer legitimacy on the children of intercaste marriage. And there was such a vehement pushback against that bill. By who? By the Hindu mainstream embodied in Congress. You know, they were the Hindu right of the time. It's not the Hindu right that we are accustomed to seeing today. Because Sangh Parivar, RSS came into existence only in 1925. I'm talking about a bill that was introduced in the Imperial Legislative Council in 1918. There were people like Madan Mohan Malviya, Surendranath Banerjee, who pushed against it and who raised concerns that are very similar to today's concerns that are raised in the context of, say, this love jihad and all that. That Hindu khatre mein hai, meaning Hindus are in danger if you allow these intercaste marriages to take place, especially the pratiloma form of intercaste marriage as opposed to anuloma. What this means is that if an upper caste woman is allowed to marry a lower caste man, then that's terrible. That's completely unacceptable. It's much like how when it comes to Hindu men marrying Muslim women, they don't have much of a problem with it. But if Hindu women are allowed to marry Muslim men, then they would read all sorts of sinister motives into it and call it love jihad, right? So there was that kind of opposition then. And it took a 30-year struggle. Mind you, when this kind of opposition was being made against this bill in the Legislative Council, there were voices against that bill even from outside. And those voices included Gandhi. That's why in my book, Gandhi doesn't quite come across as a Mahatma. He parroted that line that this was something uncalled for because it was diverting attention from political priorities and so on. So it took a 30-year struggle and repeated attempts for that intercaste marriage bill, something which you would today take for granted. What is wrong with intercaste marriage? But our society, the leaders of our society, of our community, were grappling with this as though it's some terrible issue. For 30 years they opposed it, and only in 1949 it was finally passed. Why in 49? Because by then we attained independence, and then if they continue to oppose, it would become obvious that the reason why a reform that was so much in the interest of Hindu community was delayed for so long, not because there was any opposition to it from the colonial administration, but it is because these custodians of Hindu interests, self-styled custodians of Hindu interests, these caste Hindus, these Brahminical elements, they were opposing it. So that was something which they didn't want to be exposed. So in 49, suddenly all those fears of Hindu khatre mein hai evaporated, and it was passed unanimously in 49. I mean, this turnaround is significant.
Manoj, thank
Sorry.
you.
Sorry. I can go on and on. I'm very sorry. Yeah, please keep interrupting
I absolutely
me.
love your stamina, but I would like to get a word once in a while. So the thing is, there's something I would like to draw, your attention parallelly to this, is that the Dravidian self-respect marriages start happening around, let's say, 1929. The first Dravidian self-respect conference happens, and a lot of people across caste lines are getting solemnized in these self-respect marriages. And in some way, I think the history of the South, as much as there's a lot of regressive stuff, we still have honor killings, like they happened just a month ago in Tamil Nadu. But we also have this standing against the national mainstream, the way in which the political organizations of the state, whether it's the Dravidar Kazhagam, whether it was the erstwhile Justice Party, or even the DMK under Anna, and the way they tried to formalize the self-respect marriage, but also hundreds of people, hundreds and thousands of people were getting married, not worrying about the consequence of what it held. So what do you, and don't you think that played an effect on the fact that, did it change consciousness, or was it just a kind of like pushback, or like we just the South, we do what we want to do? Like, how do you read this?
Yeah, if a lot of Meena's questions pertain to South, it's not a coincidence, because when it came to caste prejudice, when it came to untouchability, it might be hard for us to believe, given the way southern states are today, given the fact that they are acknowledged to be scoring very high in human development indices and social indicators and what have you. Not too long ago, we were worse than, South was worse than North. What was prevalent here was not just untouchability, but unapproachability and unseeability. Because of that, there was a bit of dialectics at work. Because our situation was so bad, some of the greatest reforms also took place in the South. And one such reform pertains to this Suya Maryade, or self-respect form of marriage. And, it was after independence, the Madras High Court actually struck it down, saying that, look, this is not a form of marriage that would be recognized by our scriptures. It's not in keeping with our custom. Why? Because a marriage, for it to be recognized, it would have to be solemnized by a Brahmin priest, not any priest, a priest who is a Brahmin, and he will have to chant those mantras that are appropriate for that caste. Suppose you are a lower caste, then the mantras would be from Puranas, and suppose you are an upper caste, then the mantras would be from Vedas. So there were all these complex factors involved in it. So Rajaji, as a Brahmin himself perhaps, he found it apt to say that, okay, I'm not going to be now coming to your rescue and adopting a rights-based approach and say, yes, it should be allowed to be solemnized by anybody who is competent. He said no. He instead called it non-conforming marriage bill and treated it as a crime for which he's giving a one-time amnesty scheme. He says, okay, whatever marriages have taken place till now, they all can now get their marriages regularized by getting them registered before the registry, the closest registry, and then hereafter no such marriages will take place. So this was unacceptable to the self-respect movement, and it was only after DMK came to power in 1967 that one of the first reforms that Annadurai government undertook was to amend the Hindu Marriage Act to allow this self-respect marriage to take place, where it's no more necessary for that marriage to be conferred, to be solemnized by a Brahmin priest. It's no more necessary for it to be in keeping with whatever is the custom of that region. No mantras are necessary, no saptapadi, nothing. So even this was not mandatory. Kanyadan, no tali, because they were clearly of the view that what would be ideal is have only bilateral gestures. You could have exchange of garlands, you could have exchange of rings. But if somebody insisted that unless you have tali, then that person also was given that option. It's an enabling law. But this was the ideal scheme that this law came up with. And in the initial years, it was embraced with great enthusiasm. But unfortunately, in recent years, it's no more that popular, and that has to do with a new kind of Hindu consciousness that is spreading across the country.
Thank you. Manoj, we may have like another 10 minutes, I think, before we open up the floor. But one of the big questions I really wanted to ask you, and why your book spoke so much to me, was in the late 90s, I never watched television, so I wake up and read the papers, and every day the news used to be like Lakshmanpur Bate, Ranveer Sena strikes again, and these used to be headlines in the Indian Express, the kind of caste atrocities that took place in Bihar by the feudal armies, but also elsewhere in the country. And one of those things is like, okay, this happens in front of your eyes, and you believe that at some point there will be justice. So the precursor to all this, and which is why I went back to study the Kilvenmani massacre, where 44 Dalits were burnt alive in Tanjavur district.
She did an amazing novel on that episode.
And
Gypsy Princess.
And everybody was acquitted. Literally everyone, every single landlord, some of them didn't even spend us one day in jail, and they were all acquitted. And then you think, okay, that is 1968. Maybe if some massacre is happening in 1999, there's going to be justice. Maybe the judicial system has developed. But what we see, and what is very striking about your entire work here, is that even if there are struggles to change the law, even if there are struggles to change the mindset, even if all these are enshrined, people are committing these extreme forms of violence because they believe in judicial impunity. They believe they will not be punished. And whether you look at Shankar Biga, whether you look at Lakshmanpur Bate, whether you look at Kilvenmani, every single incident is complete acquittal of everyone. And what do you think about this? And how do you think caste annihilation movements today should address this issue? This is my first question. And the second question is, do you think the composition of the judiciary in some way affects how it thinks?
Okay. Let me begin by saying, my book has 18 chapters. And as I said, my original plan was to focus on violence. But in the way it turned out, only the last 2 chapters deal with violence. And that sort of is appropriate for it to figure there towards the end of the book, because the chapters that preceding it give you a sense of where this impunity was coming from, right? So now, in cases like Lakshmanpur Bate or Batani Tola, Lakshmanpur Bate in particular is worth mentioning because it's the caste atrocity with the highest death toll, about 60 odd people. And, the trial court took it very seriously and pronounced the highest number of death penalties in any single case. It's more than even in Godra, that is otherwise so well known, right? Yet, the same case, when it goes to the High Court, all of the accused, all of the convicted persons, some were given life sentence and some were given death sentence. All of them, without exception, were acquitted. Now, how does that happen? Now, the matter, it's another matter that the matter, it's still pending before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court never seems to have time for that. And as she said, there are many such glaring cases where, there's a lot of evidence which compelled trial courts in many of them to convict, but the appellate courts went on to overturn that. But there were also some cases, in fact, the first of the two chapters that I wrote on violence, first one deals with instances of complete impunity, where all the accused are acquitted, irrespective of the evidence, irrespective of the scale of the violence. But in the second chapter, I deal with cases where there are convictions, all right, but with the caveat that there was no caste angle to that violence. One such example is Khairlanji. That took place in this century. And as recently as 2019, the Supreme Court happened to pronounce its verdict on that case. And Supreme Court towed that line. Yes, the crime did take place, the convictions need to be upheld, but there's no caste angle to it. This is despite the fact, I don't know if you're familiar with it, it's about one family of Dalits who were killed because the female members of that family apparently deposed against Kunbi Marathas, OBCs, and they were so upset with it that in retaliation they wiped out that family. They massacred that family. Now, the disproportionate reaction, that offense, the case in which they were supposed to have deposed against them is not such a big case. It's some case of assault. Now, that was not going to involve this kind of penalty, but here they took law into their hands and liquidated this entire family. And the youngest one, Priyanka Bhotmange, was a teenager. Her body was found stark naked, floating in a canal. Now, that's a compelling circumstance which fits into the norm of caste atrocities often involving sexual assault. But when the Supreme Court refers to, there are repeated references to Priyanka Bhotmange in the Supreme Court judgment, but not once do they touch upon this very telltale piece of evidence that her body was found naked. Had they mentioned it, they would have found it difficult to deny that there was a caste angle to it, right? And let me mention, because she also asked about the composition of judges. Now, the Supreme Court bench that dealt with it did have a Dalit judge, Bhushan Gawai, who's going to become, I think, Chief Justice of India someday. And he was also party to this legislation, to this judgment, which does not do full justice, because there was a caste angle which needed to be acknowledged. And that was the reason why the sole surviving member was fighting for that. And he died without the satisfaction of getting that full justice. So composition per se doesn't seem to work. We would like, diversity is a desirable quality, but then the system seems to be so compromised, or it's so hard for the few members who represent diversity to really have their way. One doesn't know, what prevailed in each of those
Manoj,
cases.
my question is not so much about, okay, is 2 or 3 or 10 or 20 Dalits going to change the thing? But for instance, in the Kilvinmani massacre case, I know very clearly that the accused was Gopalakrishna Naidu.
Yeah.
And when the case came up in the Madras High Court, the Chief Justice at that time, it was actually called not Tamil Nadu High Court, it was called the Tamil Naidu High Court. It was filled with that many Naidus. So, the entire And I generally think that everybody has pointed about the Brahmanical nature of the judiciary, the excessive, and you don't have to actually go looking for the composition. Even if you look at the judgments against reservation, and constantly I believe that the judiciary has acted at every stage. I mean, far more than the legislative, far more than any other arm of the state, in the most and explicitly anti-reservation manner as possible. So I do believe, I mean, we can agree to disagree on that. I generally believe that the composition at this point is extremely lopsided. So obviously, I don't think does having female presence change things? Not necessarily. You see, you believe that women will do greater justice, but what's happening to Umar Khalid? We all know that just because there's a woman doesn't mean there's empathy. Likewise, just because there are Dalit doesn't mean there's going to be justice. But at some point, there will be I believe in what you call the dialectics, right? When the quantity changes, the quality will change. At some point, we'll make that inflection, I believe.
Yeah.
So
diversity is necessary, but it may not be sufficient.
No, not even diversity. I mean, diversity is this very corporate word. I mean, we need reservation. I mean, I'm very explicit. I mean, diversity is what, Google claims diversity because they give curd rice in their canteens. I mean, that's not my kind of diversity. So I think we have to be much more explicit. I have one more question.
There's also this complexity that in many of these instances of violence, let's bear in mind that the culprits are not necessarily members of the traditional upper caste. They're often OBCs. And this is to do with the fact that they live in the same space.
Oh, definitely. No, definitely, hugely. I mean, and OBCs need all the calling out in the world because, that's a part of what Periyar actually says that, right? Like, the Dalit is not humiliated by any of the scriptures because he exists outside the scriptures. Whereas if you are a Shudra, what the scripture says is that, you're of unknown parentage or problematic parentage or whatever Periyar chooses to call in his very colorful language. I'm not going to repeat that here. So I have one more interesting question. So one of those things in which, when we were discussing about this book, you said that Hindutva, how do you look at Hindutva as, some kind of political Brahmanism? But, even going beyond that, I was more interested in how does this tension between political Hindutva and religious Hindutva play out? And the very striking image that comes into mind, which I think we all can deconstruct, is the Prana Pratishtha ceremony at Ayodhya. So a lot of Sankracharyas were boycotting it, obviously, and one Sankracharya went so on as to say, if he is going to touch the idol, am I going to sit outside and watch? And saying that, these are not according to the principles of Sanatana Dharma, and that, there are rules on who can and who cannot touch.
Which are spelt out in Aamas.
Yeah, so these are but explicitly it was somehow saying without not saying that this Shudra guy, what's his job? And the second comes to the question of Agamas, right? So in Agama temple, a Shudra is not allowed into the sanctum sanctorum. So does it mean they have constructed a temple that's not agamic in its tradition? Or is it that at some point Brahmanic Hindutva knows that they have to dial down, they have to pedal back in order for Hindutva to assert itself? And I find this very, in terms of spectacle and in terms of power play, very interesting. How do you unpack? Or is it very cleverly managed and stage managed and choreographed because they know that the Hindutva project does not have the numbers of only the elite upper caste. They need the lower caste. They need to show them they're inclusive. So how do you see this play out? I mean, in real time.
Well, let me say that I'm delighted to answer a question relating to temple entry because this is the place where, for the first time in the country, a temple entry proclamation was issued, promulgated in 1936 by the then ruler Chittura Tirunal. And this palace grounds has to do with him, right? His family, right? So now, and that inspired, leaders in the provinces that were in British India to follow the example, to emulate the example of Travancore. But it was not easy because they were repeatedly confronted with this deeply ingrained, binary of purity and pollution that was so central to their understanding of Hindu way of life. So they said, no, it is inconceivable for these members of polluting caste to come so close to the shrine, to enter the Garbhagriha, the sanctum sanctorum. So in those debates, it's very instructive that when these liberal Hindus were citing Agamas to say that it is all right for lower caste Hindus to come close to to enter the temple, then the Orthodox Hindus would respond by saying, no, you are quoting very selectively from Agamas, because the Agamas make it very clear that if a member of a polluting caste does enter the Garbhagriha, or even worse, if he happens to touch the deity, then it would, the deity, that shrine would lose its divinity. What Prana Pratishtha does is, it confers divinity on a stone, a piece of sculpture, right? They say that if a member of a lower caste comes, that divinity would disappear. So there were, in the course of these debates, somebody like, say, Satyamurthy would say, look, I relate to the higher aspects of Hinduism, not to these lower the way some of these Orthodox Hindus or these Sanatanis, self-styled Sanatanis were arguing. So in that sense, it reminded me of that. But then let's not lose sight of the fact that yes, there is a view that this Hindutva is nothing but Brahminism camouflaged as nationalism. But there is also need to recognize that they are trying to make Hindutva more palatable to Hindus across castes by making it more and more inclusive. Like in the Pran Pratishtha that she was referring to, there were 15 Yajamans, couples, who were performing ceremonies along with Modi. And many of them were from lower castes. So there is that attempt being made to reform. I mean, the very Hindu right which was opposing tooth and nail these reforms were so unabashed about citing scriptures, in their defense. Today, I mean, it is a matter of some consolation. Today, they are, forced to make these allowances, make these concessions, however grudgingly, to let members of lower castes also participate in it, because it's not politically correct anymore to be sticking to those old retrograde practices.
Thank you, Manoj, for patiently fielding all the questions. The only thing that I asked and you didn't answer, you please answer it before we open it to the floor, is Shanmugam Chetty's proclamation that people who went to the Travancore temples were banned from going to Cochin temples because they were polluted by visiting Travancore temples.
This is a sequel to the Travancore reform. As I said, Madras presidency under Rajaji tried to follow that example, but then he was hesitant still whether Tamils were ready for it. So what he did was, there was one part of Madras presidency which had Tamils, Malayalam speaking people, that is Malabar region. So he came up with a bill that was expressly confined to Malabar district. So only in Malabar district to begin with, temples were thrown open to untouchables on the ground that Malayalis in the neighboring Travancore kingdom had taken very positively to this reform, just the previous year or so. So that is how, very hesitantly, in a very incremental way, they were trying to, roll out this reform of temple entry. Now, what did Cochin, which is a neighboring princely state, do? At that time, the Diwan of the Diwan in Travancore was none other than C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer, who had a major role to play in this particular reform, right? Now, the Diwan, his counterpart in Cochin was none other than Shanmugam Chetty, who went on to become the first finance minister of India, right? So he was instrumental in coming up with a rule or a law saying that since these Hindus are entering temples where lower caste people are being allowed, now the temples are polluted and those people are polluted. So those polluted, contaminated Hindus cannot visit temples that are in Kochi. So they barred pilgrims from Travancore from entering Kochi because of that reform of temple entry. Such are the ironies that are very fascinating and instructive to look back and see how it's still playing out in subtle ways in current India.
Thank you for that answer, and thank you for this. It's very interesting anecdotally, but it also sheds so much light on what's happening in our own times.
Yeah.
Can we take questions? We'll take 2 or 3, and then Manoj can answer them.
Sure.
Yeah, please. There's 2 boys there. Yeah.
Hello. Yeah. Hi. So when the discussion was on the Vithalbhai Patel thing, so you're talking about the Congress party opposing any legislation that would kind of affect the Hindu majority per se. So the first thing that came to
the party was divided.
Okay.
A very dominant section was opposed to it, which was the reason why it could not be passed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for the
Vithalbhai Patel himself was a congressman at the time.
Okay, thank you for clarifying.
Yeah.
So my thing is, the first thing that comes to my mind is the so-called progressive southern states, their opposition to the caste census. So why do you think the same reason for opposing a caste census, or at least publicly not wanting to move ahead with a caste census, does it have a similar kind of approach as to not disturb the Hindu mainstream?
Well, as I understand it, the one instance of caste census, that is Bihar, what it showed, what it brought out is a very inconvenient fact, which is that it brought out that though we notionally have a fourfold Varna system, the top 3 Varnas don't constitute 3/4 of the Hindu population. They are between them not even 1/4. The overwhelming majority of Hindus were from the Shudra fold. And then below the 4 Varnas come the exterior caste, the Dalits, right? So now what did the Bihar caste census show? That the Shudras, the OBCs, and the extremely backward caste, who broadly are perceived to be part of the Shudra Varna, comprise as much as 63%. And to that, if you add scheduled castes and scheduled tribes are very few after Jharkhand separated from Bihar. So they together came to almost 85% of the population, and general category were only about 15%, and that included also upper caste Hindus. This 85% also included OBCs also included some lower caste Muslims. Similarly, general category included upper caste Muslims. So if you take now upper caste Muslims are not open to the EWS category that was introduced by this government in 2019. Economically weaker sections reservation of 10% that was introduced by the Modi government is meant for who? This Bihar caste census shows that 10% was meant for demographic which is no more than 10 or 12% of the population. And OBCs, who comprise 63% of the population, they have to settle for just 27%. So it will bring out, if caste census takes place in the rest of the country, it will make it very apparent that this EWS quota, the way
It's
it was
100%
designed,
reservation.
who is loaded in favor of the poor among the upper castes. Whereas the poor among the lower castes, they have to fulfill so many criteria, and yet they get, much less in terms of percentage than what the upper castes are enjoying currently under the EWS quota. So all that will come to the fore. So that's one reason why I believe, this is not the only reason, but this could be one important reason why they are so cagey about letting caste census take place.
My question is basically on the kind of tokenism that the Hindutva right wing has been adopting since their what you say reformist praxis. Like when Savarkar says this should be a Hindu Rashtra, he says Hindutva should encompass the Hindu fold in together. And when it comes to the BJP in politics, after the Godhra riots, they choose APJ Abdul Kalam to be candidated as the president. Or then when the violence against the Dalits are at the highest, they bring Ramnath Kovind as the president, or now the Draupadi Murmu as the president. So this kind of tokenism, or when it comes to the Ram temple, we see that the prime minister who goes against the Shankaracharyas or the so-called priestly caste to go to the Pran Pradishta himself. So this all plays out in such a reformist, quote-unquote, fashion. But my question is how to counter this action, because we very well know that this reformist, quote-unquote, action is just what the flowery frills of the dark unseen.
No, I agree with you. Just before Manoj, I want to say a lot of fascism depends on the spectacle, depends on what they signal and what they show. So I think, yeah, we need to we need to also develop our own aesthetics, our own protest, our own resistance. That also, in some way, you know, like I mean, we still on the left, for instance, we still have manels. We still don't let our women speak. We still think that the best brains of our society happen to be men, right? So and in that sense, we are not even catching up with the right, you know, in terms of signaling. But I think we have to learn. I mean, anyway, Manoj, it's your question.
You've
it's a question for you.
You've answered the question. All I can add to what she said is, you know, as a storyteller, as a researcher, as somebody who just did this book packed with untold stories, so many counterintuitive facts, they are very thought-provoking. They do put a lot of today's events in perspective. So I would think that one very effective antidote, not the only one, but one very effective antidote would be to, you know, unearth more and more such facts. Like the other day, I mean, just yesterday, you know, Modi put the Congress government on the defensive on the question of reservations. He said Nehru government also was opposed to it. Now, if Congress side or if other independent researchers do their research properly, there is so much stuff that you can come out with that will put their side also in an embarrassing spot. I mean, the kind of reactions that the Hindu right came out with against the Constitution when it was just enacted, the way they attacked it. Today, it is politically convenient for them to pay lip service to the Constitution, to pay lip service to Ambedkar, but this was not their original position, right? So they have changed. So you can point out their U-turns also, right? So facts are one very effective way of countering any you know, false narratives or politically motivated narratives. Yeah.
My question was going to be on caste census, which you already answered. But I will ask another question. Whenever the topic of reservation is brought up, even educated people...
Sorry, will you please repeat that?
Whenever the topic of reservation is brought up, reservation topic,
yeah.
Even educated people counter it with the merit statement. Why is it hard for so-called progressive people to wrap their head around this affirmative action and the need for equality?
As it happens, I don't want to preempt myself. You know, when I did this book, in the course of my research, I unearthed so much archival material. It's a fat book. It has over 600 pages, right? But there was so much archival, unexplored, you know, legislative and judicial battles that I unearthed that I couldn't accommodate a lot of it in this book. So I'm in the process of doing a sequel, and I promise you that one of the chapters in that book, one very significant section in that book, is about the history of affirmative action, right from the time it was initiated, say first in princely states, Mysore, and then Madras under the Justice Party reign in 1920s, and then how there were battles fought around the time of the constitution making. You know, the first amendment to the constitution had to do with introducing reservations in educational institutions. 15(4) did not exist in the original constitution. It was introduced because of Champaka Dorairajan judgment in Madras High Court, right? So I'm tracing all that right down to EWS. How the very sections that were so opposed to reservations, to affirmative action, have ended up acquiring that for themselves. The irony of it, how it moved from that to this, and how it is also opportunistic. In some senses, they were betraying that old prejudice, in the way they equate a candidate from reservations with somebody lacking merit. It comes so easy to them, as if it's only the marks you score with all the advantages you have of going to privileged schools and tutorials, all that you discount, and then say, no, I am meritorious and he lacks merit simply because he gets fewer marks. But now even that gap is narrowing, so it's all a very complex issue. I will deal with that in my next book.
So Manoj has just declared himself a national treasure. We really have to protect this man because first he goes after caste violence and then he goes after reservation. So thank you for writing that book. There's a question in front. So two people, yeah.
We'll just take one more question now.
Hi, Manoj, I'm looking at the art of writing that book because despite the fact that it is about 646 pages, I think, it is a very easy read. It's very well written, and it's despite the fact that there are facts and there are dry legalese, etc., but it's a pleasurable read. So would you like to talk a little bit of how you as a journalist played a role in creating this book?
Thanks for your compliment. It means a lot to me to know that it is an easy read, because it's not easy to write in that way. There's so much of technical stuff, and there's so many facts to craft this narrative out of. A narrative that sticks to the point you're trying to make and that resonates with today's India. So it took a lot of effort. And I guess it's also something that as a journalist I was trained to do. We are into storytelling, and happily I also have a legal background. So I, in a sense, represent a confluence of law and journalism. So I took it upon myself with a sense of mission to fill this gap. And what came naturally to me is the storytelling format. The stories tell a lot. It's not just a story. There's a lot embedded in stories. So letting facts speak for themselves is one very very accessible way of making a point, rather than what an academic by their training are accustomed to doing, which is go into abstract theories and theoretical frameworks and all that. Now I just let the dramatis personae speak. In the tradition of Vyasa, Mahabharata, where he gives a lot of space, to all players. They all have their reasons. Karna, Duryodhana, Krishna, Arjuna. So on day one of the Mahabharata war, he shows Krishna as God, in the course of Bhagavad Gita. But on day 18, he lets Duryodhana really give it to Krishna. He says, you are the man who's responsible for all the underhand methods that my cousins used to kill the heroes on my side. So you are such an evil person. He says all that in a very uninhibited way, and Vyasa lets him do that. So he'll leave it to readers to decide for themselves whatever they want. So I adopt that same approach. So I give a lot of space in my book to the conservative side also, to Hindus, conservative Hindus, as much as I give space to liberal, reformist Hindus, for readers to figure out for themselves where they stand, how they relate to these issues. Because many of these issues, though these battles were fought in the past, those problems still persist. And it's because those battles remain unresolved. And we don't even recognize that. There is far greater recognition, acknowledgement of race in the US than there is of caste in India. So that is what I'm trying to challenge or change through my book.
Let me ask the question that can this UCC, that is Uniform Civil Code, can be anyway linked with this caste establishment?
Can Uniform Civil Code...
can be anyway linked with this caste establishment or the persistence of caste? Uniform Civil Code.
Well, as it happens, in theory, from the time, say, the Hindu Marriage Act was passed, or even prior to that, when I said, 1949, there was a law that was passed specifically for legalizing intercaste marriage. So, now these laws have formally, technically done away with the role of caste. Now, even if there is a marriage between a Hindu, a Brahmin woman and a Dalit man, which was so completely unacceptable in the past, the Pratiloma marriage I was referring to, is today all legal. But that's only in the legal sense. So Uniform Civil Code will not change that part. The social aspect remains unchanged, as is evident from the fact that even in progressive states like Tamil Nadu and Kerala, there are instances of honor killings. And what are honor killings? Honor killings are those extreme cases where the parents themselves of the runaway couple are so gripped with that caste prejudice, that madness, that they kill their own children, right? So it's as real as that. And that happens even in this day and age, in the 21st century. So it's a living reality. So there is that divergence between what the law says and what the social reality on the ground is. So that will continue despite the Uniform Civil Code.
My question is, given that the caste system is defended by a set of religious beliefs that have endured for millennia, do you need to change those beliefs before you can stop discrimination? Or is it just that the religious component is a smokescreen to allow a group of people to oppress another?
Sorry, repeat that question.
So, given that the caste system is defended by a set of religious beliefs that have endured for millennia,
okay. I get your question.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to answer this, because that is one major difference, fundamental difference between the problem of race and the problem of caste. There are lots of parallels between them. In fact, one very popular book in the recent past on racism in US was in fact called Caste. What Isabel Wilkerson was trying to say, this is the broad sense I get, is that race is so bad that it could be equated to, that it could be compared to caste, right? Now, it is true that when these battles were being fought in legislatures and in courts, many of these defenders of caste system, the Orthodox Hindus, were in fact citing scriptures. They were quoting scriptures in their defense, right? So it is not that it is an allegation that outsiders are making. They would themselves say, this is a religiously sanctioned tradition. Why are you? This is part of our Sanatana Dharma. This is part of our eternal way of life, eternal values. So why are you coming up with some newfangled ideas of equality and trying to change what has always been the case? So this was how it was sought to be defended. And that is the reason why somebody like Ambedkar, in his famous tract called Annihilation of Caste, he would say that yes, intercaste dining is a big step forward. Even more radical, even more effective would be intercaste marriage. But even that is not sufficient. He went on to say that we need to challenge the source of this prejudice. The source lies in some of these scriptures, or some of the verses in our scriptures. So they need to be addressed. So whether you expunge them or amend them or whatever, he goes on to address, expand on that in a subsequent book of his, Riddles in Hinduism and so on. So yes, it's a problem that is there, that it's hard to in the same scriptures, I mean, the one dichotomy that these battles bring out is the progressive Hindus say our scriptures are about Advaita Vedanta. What does Advaita Vedanta do? It says that all human beings have the same divinity in them. So there's no question of somebody being inferior, somebody being impure, somebody in fact being other. We are all manifestations of the same divinity is one view. The other view said, no, but the same scriptures talk about Varna system. Even Gita talks about Varna system. They quote it. In fact, there is a reference to in one of those debates about one expression that is used in Gita called Papa Yoni. Krishna uses this expression that if you broadly adhere to the dharma, the Varna dharma, if you observe the caste duties, caste lines, then it's not just Brahmins and Kshatriyas who will benefit from it. In that particular context, he separates Vaishyas from it. So he says it's not just Brahmins and Kshatriyas who will benefit from it, but also he goes on to list out 4 categories. One, I mean, I'll skip the first one. The second is Vaishyas. Third is women, and fourth is Shudras. They will also benefit. Now, what is the first one he mentions? It is Papayonis. So this debate was, what is this Papayoni Krishna is talking about? Who are these people who are born of a sinful womb? So then there is this debate. So one side says, Gita was written before these punctuation marks came into being. So you can't treat it as colon, that, Papayonis, colon, Vaishyas, women and Shudras. Because it would mean that all these are born of sinful womb. That's an unacceptable interpretation. So those who are trying to uphold the orthodoxy said you have to put a comma there. Papayoni, comma, women, comma, Vaishyas, comma, Shudras. Now, even if you take this approach, the question still remains, who are these Papayonis? In fact, they are so important in Krishna's conception that they come first. So who are these Papayonis? So there are these questions that they were debated in the course of these very fascinating, revealing debates, legislative debates on caste. I refer to this particular one in my book, so you can look it up. So it's there. So, thank you.